There's a specific kind of game that doesn't end when you put it down. The movement is still in your hands. The loop is still running somewhere in your head. You're lying in bed, calculating whether you have time for one more run. The pixel art is part of it. There's something about a small, readable screen that makes the brain want to keep going, but the real reason they're dangerous is that each one builds a loop you don't want to break. Hack is a post-apocalyptic Metroidvania from Chinese studio Bling Game, where the hookshot isn't just a traversal tool. It doubles as a hacking instrument for interacting with the technological ruins of a collapsed civilization. Pulling an enemy toward you to destroy them, and pulling a switch across a gap to open a door use the same input with the same physical logic, which means the game's action and its puzzle design exist in the same mechanical vocabulary rather than being two separate modes. The movement feels designed by someone who understood that a Metroidvania's traversal loop needs to be satisfying as raw motion before any world context justifies it. The world is dense and interconnected in ways that reward backtracking with a distinct set of discoveries per revisit. Upgrades change what the hookshot can reach, which changes which surfaces are traversal assets, which changes where new paths open. The art direction leans into the post-apocalyptic setting with desaturated industrial palettes interrupted by neon accents. The visual language communicates a world of decayed infrastructure running on scavenged power, which is exactly the world the story describes. The music, electronic and rhythmic, sets a pace that traversal matches. Hack runs shorter than the genre average, and the narrative is carried by atmosphere more than character or dialogue. Players who come for the movement and the exploration will find it consistently delivers both. The rhythm of hookshot, dash, swing, Hack builds a tempo that makes extended sessions feel shorter than they are, which is exactly the kind of loop that turns a planned hour into 3. Deedlit in Wonder Labyrinth is a Castlevania Symphony of a Night tribute built by Team Ladybug, the studio behind Toho Luna Nights, and it wears that lineage with precision and purpose. The map structure, the drop mechanics, the sub-weapon system, all of it reads clearly from the IGA lineage. What Team Ladybug added is the elemental spirit system. Deedlit carries 2 spirits, wind and fire. They can be swapped anytime, and the mechanic governs both combat and defense simultaneously. Fire absorbs fire damage and powers fire aspect weapons. Wind absorbs wind attacks and enables different magical options. Reading an enemy's elemental identity and aligning your spirit accordingly creates a rhythm of rapid reads and swaps that keeps combat mentally active in a way that pure reflex games don't. The Ikaruga comparison in the hook is apt. The spirit swapping under pressure in a room full of mixed elemental threats produces a cognitive challenge that the standard Metroidvania combat loop rarely reaches. Boss fights are the peak of this. Each one is an elemental puzzle that plays on your absorption and exploit timing simultaneously. The game is short, around 5 to 7 hours, and the completion percentage visible in the UI makes the hidden secrets a persistent pull after the credits. The pixel art is exceptional. Expressive character sprites, varied environments that read immediately across biomes, and boss designs that communicate their attack patterns visually before they execute them. Team Ladybug builds games for players who loved Symphony of the Night and want something that understood why. Rusted Moss is built around a bungee cord, not a traditional grappling hook that extends to a fixed point, a bungee that attaches to surfaces and swings with elastic physics, meaning the arc, the timing, and the momentum it generates all follow rules that reward actual physical intuition rather than just directional input. The Metroidvania structure gives you a world to apply this movement to, but what you're actually learning is a sport. Peak traversal in Rusted Moss is genuinely athletic. Reading the next anchor point while managing the current swing's arc, making micro adjustments to landing position midair, using the elastic tension to launch rather than just swing. The twin stick shooting keeps combat from interrupting the movement. You can aim and fire while the bungee is doing its work, which means the best players maintain flow through encounters rather than stopping to fight. The world expands as your understanding of what the bungee can do expands, which is Metroidvania design functioning exactly as intended. New areas open not because you collected an ability, but because you learned something. The visual presentation is watercolor and desaturated, more melancholy than most games in the genre, and the story threads that weave through the exploration are worth following. The learning curve is the real challenge. The bungee physics are demanding enough that the first hour may feel like it's fighting you. Players who push through that adjustment into genuine mastery describe the experience of flowing through a difficult area as something close to flow state. That gap between early frustration and late mastery is the game's risk, and for players who accept the investment, it pays off. Noida simulates every pixel. That's not a figure of speech. The Finnish studio Nala Games built a falling sand physics engine where each particle of water, fire, sand, oil, acid, and smoke behaves according to actual simulated rules, and then made a roguelite where you fall into an increasingly hostile underground and cast spells built from a wand crafting system of almost absurd depth. The addiction has two sources and they compound each other: the wand system and the experiments. Wands are built from spells slotted in sequence. The spells interact with each other, the projectile physics, and the environment based on the simulation underneath. A spark bolt with a trigger spell and a chain reaction inside a water-filled cavern produces something the game didn't script. You produced it by understanding how the pieces interact. The search for the next wand combination that breaks the current run is genuinely open-ended. There are interactions players are still discovering years after release. The experiments come from the environment itself. What happens if you pour oil on that fire? What does acid do to that material? Noida invites you to be curious in ways that most games only gesture at. Death resets everything. The run you were on is gone. Your discoveries about the wand interactions survive in your memory only. The next run begins at level 1. At some point, you will lose a run you genuinely believed was the one. Good enough wand, good enough build, one mistake, and you will start again anyway because the previous run already showed you something worth finding. Gravity Circuit takes Mega Man's bones and replaces the projectile-based combat with a melee combo system that turns every room into an arcade brawler. You're a combat android that fights with chain attacks that can be linked, canceled, and extended through a system of upgrades called circuits, earned from stage completions and optionally purchased mid-run with recovered parts. The combo ceiling is genuinely high. By the time the game's late stages arrive, the gap between a player who has learned the system and one who hasn't is enormous and completely visible. The enemy design is built around the melee focus. Enemies have specific attack patterns and vulnerabilities that the combo system is positioned to exploit, and the satisfaction of reading a room, entering with momentum, and leaving without taking a hit is exactly the reward that the Mega Man genre promises and rarely delivers this cleanly. Boss fights are the highlight. Each robot master has a move set that invites adaptation rather than pattern memorization, and the circuits you earn from them reshape how you approach both the bosses and the stages on subsequent runs. Gravity Circuit is one of those games that reveals more of itself the better you get at it. The early stages are manageable on basic play. The later ones aren't, and the difficulty spike is calibrated specifically to force engagement with the combo system rather than brute force button mashing. That's the right design choice, and the game commits to it throughout, including optional challenge rooms that exist purely to test mastery without story justification. Astalin gives you 3 characters and a pact with death. The mage Algus, in exchange for the team's ability to resurrect indefinitely, has promised his soul to a Death Titan once their mission in the Tower of Serpents is complete. Death doesn't reset your progress. It sends you back to the tower's entrance, where soul orbs collected from enemies can purchase permanent upgrades. You come back stronger. The tower remembers every door you unlocked, every switch you threw, every shortcut you carved. The three characters each hold keys to areas the others can't access. Keely's double jump opens vertical paths. Algus's magic triggers specific switches. Arius can take more punishment in rooms that punish cautious play. Early in the game, swapping between them requires reaching a campfire. Later, an item allows instant switching, and the tower redesigns itself around that capability in real time. Paths that were linear become branching, and reading which character the current room requires becomes the primary puzzle. The 8-bit presentation looks like a Lost Nest game that somehow has better dungeon design than most things that actually shipped in that era. What makes Astalin impossible to stop is that each death feeds back into the next attempt in a visible way. You're not resetting, you're iterating. The tower becomes more familiar with each run, the shortcuts accumulate, and the gap between where you died last time and where you'll reach this time narrows in a way you can feel. Huntdown is a run-based side-scrolling shooter built on cover mechanics, meaning you can't hold down fire and walk through levels. You have to read enemy patterns, use environment geometry to break line of sight, time exposures, and manage the specific weapon you're carrying against the specific gang in front of you. Each of the three bounty hunters plays differently. Anaconda is methodical and precise, John Sawyer has explosive utility, and Mo-Man floods rooms with projectiles. The three-act structure, each governed by a different gang with distinct enemy types and boss mechanics, gives the game enough variety to sustain repeated runs without novelty wearing down. The sound design is the secret weapon. Every hit confirmation, every weapon reload, every enemy grunt has been tuned to communicate a satisfying response. The tactile feedback of landing a clean burst into a group of gang members, like the boss voice line when you finally break their phase, these details make Huntdown feel more substantial than its runtime suggests. Enemy quips between phases are genuinely funny and give the whole thing a tone closer to 80s action comedy than straight homage. The 16-bit aesthetic is a deliberate visual language, bright, readable, immediate, built for legibility under pressure. Hard mode and the per-stage rank system do what the best arcade game design does. Provide a ceiling for skilled play that makes completion feel like an intermediate step rather than a final one. Huntdown is short enough to finish in an evening and designed well enough that finishing once isn't the point. Cyber Shadow is a game that does not forgive. Published by Yacht Club Games and developed by solo developer Arne Hunziker over several years, it draws from NES-era action games, primarily Ninja Gaiden, and builds on them with modern precision. Shadow, a ninja in a cyborg-overrun city, fights through stages that demand pattern recognition, resource management from a limited special attack meter, and the kind of spatial awareness that comes from learning a room well enough to know which enemies hit which hitboxes before you enter. Deaths are abundant, and each one teaches something. The loop that ruins sleep is the game's mastery structure. The early stages are manageable on cautious play. The mid-game forces economy and timing. The late stages combine everything into sequences where any one mistake can cascade. And the game's checkpoint system, while reasonably spaced, keeps enough at risk to make success feel genuinely earned rather than statistically achieved. The special attack charge mechanic. Defeated enemies leave energy, orbs that must be collected to power abilities. Creates a combat rhythm that rewards aggression calibrated precisely against available resources. The pixel art is expressive and atmospheric. The soundtrack drives the pace, and the boss designs are works of pattern-based architecture rather than stat checks. Cyber Shadow is the kind of game that experienced action players describe as exactly what they were looking for, and that less experienced players bounce off and then come back to later to find out they were right. The skill ceiling is high, and the path to it is steep and worth taking. Sanabi opens with a retired soldier in a cyberpunk megacity, a prosthetic chain arm, and a missing 3 million people. It's a one-hit kill action platformer built by Korean indie studio Wonder Potion, and the grappling hook at its center isn't just a traversal tool. It's everything. Hooking to a ceiling to carry momentum into a swing, pumping the boost at the apex to launch higher, retracting midair to gain speed, zipping to an enemy to eliminate them, and immediately reroute to the next platform before the momentum dies. The physical intelligence the game rewards is specific and builds fast. The cyberpunk city of Mago is the playground. Every vertical chunk of architecture becomes a movement puzzle the moment you understand the hook's physics. And the game keeps introducing environmental wrinkles. Moving platforms, crumbling surfaces, enemies that require specific approach angles that force you to extend what you've learned rather than repeat it. The boss encounters translate the traversal into combat scenarios where reading the arena and maintaining flow under pressure is the challenge. Killing by contact means every engagement is a movement decision first. The story follows the general and a young hacker named Mari across a sequence of reveals that the game earns through pacing rather than runtime. The cutscene density runs high, and the narrative doesn't always match the game's kinetic energy and register. Some sections slow the momentum in ways the platforming had been building against. But the movement is the reason to lose sleep over this, and the movement is exceptional. Phoenotopia Awakening is a 40-plus hour action RPG from developer Kate Cosmic that achieves something very few games manage. The sense of a world that has been thought about more than it has been shown. Towns have economies. NPCs have schedules and opinions that shift across story events. The overworld connects regions with a logic that makes geography feel real rather than designed. You play as Gale, a village girl thrust into a planetary crisis she didn't ask for, and the game's patience with her journey. The quiet sections between major events, the side quests that exist because the world is full of problems rather than because they reward a collectible. That's what gives the main story weight. The combat draws from Zelda 2's action framework, stamina-managed attacks, rolling dodges, charge strikes, and a progression of weapons and spells that create genuinely different combat approaches across the game's runtime. Some rooms require full engagement with the system. Others can be bypassed through clever movement or item use. The density of secrets, hidden rooms, optional dungeons, items that require revisiting early areas with later abilities, makes the world feel like it's constantly offering something new to find. A player who explores thoroughly will hit the 40-hour mark still finding things they hadn't seen. The game is long enough that its pacing has slow periods, and some late-game sequences run harder and longer than the experience that build up to them prepared for. These are small costs against a game that commits to its world with the kind of care that makes you want to live in it.